I just want to thank everybody for being here tonight, regardless of what your interest is. It is always nice to see people show up who are interested in the community in which they live, and who want to know more about, how some of this stuff works. And I'm grateful my friend Drew came to co-present with me. This is a big topic. It can be dry. But I think we've really put together a nice slideshow. And at the end of the day, I think what we want is just for everybody to leave here understanding more about what it takes to develop a project, both financially and from a policy perspective. And so I hope we're able to do that. We, obviously have a limited amount of time. So we will do our best to get through as much as we can. So I was born here in Idaho, and my claim to fame is I'm the 6th grade spelling bee champ at Hillcrest Elementary. And the reason I put that on the slide is because for me, I really peaked in 6th grade. And that's one of my greatest accomplishments to date. And I won on the word zucchini. And for that, I got a Robinson Crusoe book, and I got a trip to Arby's by my 6th grade teacher. So that was my first taste of success, I guess. So anyway, on to the presentation. So smart growth in and of itself is it's already confusing. One of the biggest challenges before we even talk about real estate development, before we even talk about public policy, shareholder engagement, all those things is, what is smart growth? And I would ask everyone to stop and think about what smart growth really means to you, because I would be willing to bet that it's different for everybody. Some of the things that come up when we talk about smart growth are workforce housing, low-income units, transit-oriented development, economies of scale, biophilia, go on and on and on. It really turns into an alphabet soup of cool buzzwords. And people will often throw out a desire for smart growth, and they'll throw some of these things out. And it's not only all of these things, but it's more. And depending on the development, it could be fewer than these things. And so just as a quiz, now if we were all together, I would do my best to offer some kind of treat or a prize for anybody who could get this right. But I'll have to issue an IOU to whoever can guess this right. I'd be curious if somebody would like to unmute or throw in the chat box how many references to smart growth, the phrase, show up in Blueprint Boise, which is Boise's comprehensive plan. It's about, I think, 380 or 460 pages that encompass every neighborhood in the city of Boise and what Boise's long-term plan for that neighborhood looks like. Would anyone be willing to guess how many references there are to that? And maybe if there's something in the chat box, Sarah, you can share that with me.
I just threw out my guess. I said 22. I don't see anybody else typing in anything yet.
Okay. Well, I mean,
Renee says 1.
Renee says 1. Okay.
Michelle says 100.
All
250.
Right, 22, 1, 250. I'm really shocked somebody actually got it right, and that's Renee got it right. There's one wow. Reference to smart growth, and that's not a failure of city planners to put smart growth principles in the comprehensive plan. It's just that smart growth is that confusing. And so what I did is I pulled in this quote from smartgrowthamerica.org. Their definition of smart growth is that it's about helping every town and city become a more economically prosperous, socially equitable, and environmentally sustainable place to live. This approach looks different for every community, but can help neighborhoods of any kind flourish, make towns and cities competitive, and improves lives by improving neighborhoods. And my favorite part of Smart Growth America's definition of smart growth is this section right here, is that this approach looks different for every community. And I think that's why Boise's comprehensive plan probably only has one reference to smart growth, because it depends on the neighborhood. What might make sense for the North End might not make sense at all for Southeast Boise. It might not work on the bench, and it certainly might not work in the university district. So it's different for every neighborhood. And so with that in mind, would anyone like to share a place or an area here in Boise where they feel like growth is smart, and has been smart and why that is. Is there any takers? And it's okay to share your opinion, and it's okay if you disagree with what you think somebody else thinks is smart growth.
And since we have a couple guests that are from outside the region, if you have some place like that where you live or where you're more familiar with, feel by all means. It doesn't have to be Boise.
Okay, and that's okay. I mean, maybe folks are here to learn more. It looks like Linda said maybe the Myrtle Street corridor because it combines living, working, and shopping. And I would agree. I would absolutely agree 100%. And one of the more impressive things about Myrtle Street being as successful as it is that Myrtle Street's also a highway, technically. So it's a highway that runs through a downtown, but it's still activated and still a nice place to be. So thank you, Linda. Just a quick caveat that as we go through this presentation, when Drew and I are talking about smart growth, we're generally referring to development with a focus on mixed transit and mixed housing options. So essentially higher density projects that cater to an entire income spectrum. And it's just implied that by their very nature, smart growth projects are more complicated than a quote unquote standard development. So as we move forward, that's what we're talking about: higher density, mixed income, transit oriented. So I'm going to talk about development finance basics. And the reason I want to do this is I want everyone to understand from the development side, what do developers look at when they are proposing a development? And I want everyone to understand that, because I think it's easy from 10,000 feet up to be critical maybe of developers in general, and be critical of what developers ask for from cities when they ask for variances or variations on their projects. So I just want to present what for some is going to be very basic, and for some this is going to be completely new. So ultimately, I hope that everyone gets something out of this. And so when we're talking about development finance, we have a couple of components. And what's up on the screen is on the left-hand side, that photo is a picture of an actual piece of land for sale in Wilder, Idaho, that you could go buy if you had about $1.75 million. And this is the land component of any real estate development. And on the right is our downtown Zion's Bank building. And when you build on land, that's typically referred to the improvements. So you improve land by building something there. And as long as that fits into the community fabric and it fits into the neighborhood and it meets the highest and best use of that piece of land, that's a good improvement. So we have a land cost and we have the cost of the improvements. And one of our other big expenses is we have a project team of architects and engineers and project managers and consultants who help make sure that we construct improvements that are going to be used to their highest and best use. And that's it. Those are the three major costs, except that those are not the costs. Those are just the beginning of the costs. We have thousands of other costs, it feels like sometimes. We have impact fees. We have entitlement and permitting fees. That's just to get a permit to construct on our land. We have to hire engineers to tell us if we can build the building we want on the soil, the native soil. And if the native soil is inadequate, we have to bring new soil in. We have to hook up to existing utilities, and that is also not cheap. A 4-inch sewer connection in the city of Boise can run you about $90,000 for up to 80 connections or 80 units in a building. So it gets very expensive very fast. One of the things that you might hear a lot, whether you're reading the Statesman or Boise Dev or whatever news you like to ingest, is, does it pencil? You might hear this a lot, that a project didn't pencil or it was changed because it didn't make financial sense. And so there are different kinds of developers who have different goals. There are long-term hold developers. A lot of times these are family offices. But the best example in my mind of family office developers, Hawkins Companies right here in Boise. They develop and they hold their developments and they put it into their portfolio and they keep the income. There are merchant developers. These developers, they develop projects with the intent to sell, and they contract out everything else. They don't handle leasing. They don't handle tenant relations. That's all done by somebody else. And then there are preferred developers, and preferred developers can be both long-term developers and merchant developers. But these are developers who've proven adept at developing a certain type of product. And so somebody like Staples or Petco or Whole Foods or Winco will approach these developers and say, we want you to develop stores for us. And they collect a fee and they build stores for their clients. So regardless of the type of developer that you are, at the end of the day, every development has to financially make sense. And kind of like smart growth, whether that makes sense or not depends on what kind of developer you are. So in my opinion, a development quote unquote pencils if the expected return is sufficient relative to the risk enough to induce someone to undertake the endeavor. In short, if you can get enough money out of it to make all the hassle of developing a project worth your while, then it pencils. Keep in mind too that real estate development takes a really long time. So from the time you get a piece of land under contract, you get it zoned, you get a project, you get something put together, you have a lender on board, you have your equity lined up, that can take 1 to 2 years. So by the time you get it under construction, you have another 1 to 2 years, and then leasing up the project can take another 1 to 2 years, depending on complexity of the project. So the developer is exposed to all kinds of risk during that time period. They're exposed to market risk. If you're building a 1,000 unit apartment building and suddenly the economy tanks because of something disastrous like coronavirus is a huge black swan issue that the entire market is dealing with, you know, suddenly your project might not make sense and you can't just put the brakes on it. So there's a lot of risk. There's a huge amount of risk involved, and these projects take a long, long time. So what I have here is this is a sources and uses budget for a real estate development project. This is based on an actual project that I am the project manager for right now for my employer. The numbers are different, but it mirrors almost pretty closely, almost exactly a 50 unit apartment complex that we're working on. And you'll see at the top, we have our sources. Everybody wants to know where the money's going to come from. And then we have our uses down here in the bottom. And this tells us what we're going to be spending all of our money on. And up here at the top, what I want to point out is the developer always has to show up with something. This is the government is not going to show up with a no interest loan for a real estate developer like they might for a first-time homeowner. So the developer has to show up with cash. And a lot of times they do this with land or a mix of land and cash. So as long as they have some money in the deal, that makes lenders pretty happy. And the other thing I want to talk about too is this developer fee. So every developer, regardless of whether they're developer, the developer collects a fee, and this is built into the project cost. And that developer fee is paid out in increments, usually dictated by the investor if they have a large investor, or dictated by the bank. So when the developer closes on the land and on the loan and they're prepared to start their project, they might get a third of that. They might get another third once the project gets a certificate of occupancy. And then they might get the last third when it meets lease-up hurdles or cash flow hurdles or debt service hurdles. So this is kind of like a carrot on a stick for the developer to keep going. They don't get this all up front. And a lot of times this pays for their overhead, for their employees and their consultants, and to keep the lights on in their offices. So what we have here is we have a developer bringing in $3.5 million and a lender willing to provide $7.5 million to construct this $11 million project. And so what we have is a loan to cost, that is the loan amount divided by the cost of the project of 68%. So the developer has 32% equity in this deal. Now, and everyone likes that. Lenders like that, municipalities like that. You're a lot less likely to walk away from a project if you have quite a bit more skin in the game. So here we have a have what's called a pro forma, or a projected P&L, a profit and loss statement. This is what a developer will put together to start to look at whether or not a project pencils. Will this project provide enough income to make it a worthwhile endeavor? And I want you to notice something, that this project is set to be done and stabilized in 2023. So that's 3 years that the developer, in this case us, will be building and leasing up to try to stabilize a project. So we estimate our income, and for this example, I'm using 50 units at market rents for the community that we're in. And down here, we have our net operating income. This is the cash flow that we expect this project to bring in when it's complete and stabilized. So hopefully at the end of the day, after all the revenue comes in from rents and we pay all of the expenses, we'll have $733,000 every year. And so let's look at some of the metrics that then developers are really interested in. The first one here is the cap rate of 5.75%. Now you could get a PhD in studying cap rates. They offer it at some larger universities in their finance programs. It's very fascinating, but it's a tool used to capitalize a stream of rental income to arrive at a value that you would pay or sell a project for. Basically what it's saying is, if this project gets $733,000 a year for 10 years, what are you willing to pay for that stream of income over the next 10 years? And an appraiser or other professional decides on 5.75%. And that cap rate is a collection of risk premiums. So that number can go up and down depending on the size of the project, the location, and assumptions about the future, whether everyone is optimistic into the future and believe that it will stay rented and they can collect more rent, or if they're pessimistic about the future. This number right here, this cap rate, is the most argued over number in a real estate deal. Grown men and women will scream at each other about 0.25%. If it's 0.25% too high, the seller's mad. If it's 0.5% too low, the buyer's mad. Everyone's mad about this number. It matters a lot. The next metric is our cash on cash return. This is simply the first year cash flow from the project divided by the cash that the developer has to put in to help build the project. And in our example here, it's $3.5 million. So in 2023, we'll have spent $3.5 million, and our return on that $3.5 million will be $733,000. So 21% is a pretty good return. But remember that 21% is 3 years from now. So inflation eats into this 2% a year for 3 years. Our real rate of return is closer to 15%. So what the developer has to do is decide if that's a good return. And you look at alternative returns in the market. Can you get 20% investing in treasury notes? Of course not, but that's lower risk. Can you get 20% investing in a money market? No, of course not, but it's lower risk. And the last metric that we're going to talk about that developers look at is return on cost, where this is simply the cost to construct of $11 million divided by the stabilized value, $12.7 million. All this number tells us is that there's value add here. If we spend $11 million to build this project, it'll be worth $12.7 million. Not a single one of these on its own will make or break a project, but they all in conjunction work together to help developers make a decision on whether they're going to go forward with the project in its current state or change some things or abandon it altogether. So real estate, though, is like a falling set of dominoes, or some real estate projects can be like a ship continually popping leaks all over the place. And every time you fill one, a leak pops up somewhere else. You can't change a single assumption about a project without it creating havoc elsewhere. So if you lower your income assumptions, it'll change your value. It'll change your cash on cash return. If the costs increase, it changes some of your return metrics. So in my example, I have mean old city council. Everyone's always mad at city council. Say we have to go to city council to request a zoning variance. And while we're in there, city council decides that we can't have 50 units, but we can have 40 units. And the only way they'll approve is if we decrease the number of units in our project. So what you see here is our gross income goes down by quite a bit because we have 10 fewer units. Our income goes down. And in this case, it doesn't hurt our metrics too bad because our costs go down as well. We're putting less cash in the deal because it's a smaller deal. But remember, it's like a set of falling dominoes. A smaller real estate project is not as valuable as a larger, and there's more risk in having an apartment complex with fewer units. So our cap rate has gone up a little bit. So our value has come down. So that makes a difference. So let's say City Council, in addition to our unit reduction, they also decide that we need to pay for a bus stop out front, and we have to dedicate a right-of-way to the transit authority, and we have to install solar panels for electric vehicle charging stations. And they're not going to approve it unless we do all these things. You'll see that our income's unaffected, but our costs start to really take a hit because all of those things cost more money. We can't necessarily raise our rents on fewer units. Now our cap rate is also being affected, so our value continues to come down. So our cash on cash return is lower. Now our return on cost is negative. So it might cost now $9.9 million or $9.1 million to build this, or excuse me, $9.8 million to build this, and it's worth $9.4 million. So, who would take that on? It's not necessarily that no one would do this, but you need to understand who would do this, if anyone. So my first financing challenge is when it comes to financing smart growth, cities, municipalities, neighborhoods, neighborhood associations, and any stakeholder who wants to be involved, they have to, when they define what a smart development looks like in a given area, they have to understand what universe of developers will step up to the plate, if any at all. If you don't involve the developers early on, and you decide that a 10-acre infill parcel in downtown Boise has to have a certain number of requirements for a developer to build there, what you might find out is that no project will ever make sense there. So the first financing challenge is really understanding and getting your developers involved and all your stakeholders involved early on as cities and municipalities start to frame out what smart growth looks like in their neighborhoods and in their cities. So one of the things that you've probably been reading about or maybe hearing about recently is how Google and Amazon and Facebook and all these companies are stepping up to help fix these housing crises in the cities in which they do business. And so I was at a housing conference where the housing, the executive director of the housing agency for the state of Washington was saying that Amazon, had stepped up with between $30 and $50 million to help with housing. However, they were also expecting a 20% return on all of that quote unquote low income housing. So this is a great example of somebody coming to the plate. They're stepping up and saying, we're willing to help build out low income housing. But they hadn't injected themselves into the conversation early on enough to understand that no one's ever going to get a 20% return on a low income housing project. They are by nature designed not to turn a profit. And so at present, there really is no low income housing financed by Amazon because their expectations are wildly inaccurate. So 2018, NerdWallet conducted a survey of 1,000 couples, and they just asked them who should pay on the first date. Should it be men or women? And 77.5% of people said that men should pay it on the first date, which is crazy because that means 750 men in this poll said, yes, we should have to pay on the first date. You think it would at least be 50-50, but 750 guys also said, yeah, we should have to pay. And development's a lot like that too. A straightforward development, for the most part, does not require local government review. As long as the building meets published zoning requirements and it doesn't ask for any variances, typically it goes to planning and zoning and possibly no further than that. Once you start asking for variances, say a parking reduction, or you're asking to build a building taller than is allowed by zoning or by the requirements in a given neighborhood, it goes to city council, and city council often uses these opportunities to start asking for more things on given projects in the neighborhood that they have specific long-term growth goals for. And what they can do is they can start imposing wish list items on the deal. And that happens, that's typical. And they can ask for reductions, they can ask for additions, they can ask for things that fits in with their comprehensive plan. But who should pay for those? Because what happens is, what you start to do is you have these projects that may be penciled beforehand, and then you have cities asking for things that push the project over the line, where you start to run into budget overruns, you run into schedule delays, and you run into other, impacts that maybe aren't well understood at the beginning of the project. Adding incremental costs to a project only works if the end user is amenable to paying for those additional amenities. So for an example, on average, office users in Seattle will pay 10 to 15% more for leased space in a LEED certified building. So in Seattle, that's important, but Seattle has quite a bit higher income and a lot larger businesses, and there are tenants there who are willing to pay for space in a building that meets maybe their ESG requirements as a corporation, or it just meets their internal goals as a company. They want to be in a building that saves energy. LEED certified energy is a way to signal to other people that you're serious about the environment. But things like that don't really translate to Boise, because our wages are low and our construction costs are at an all-time high, and they set new records every year. So in Boise, you can't pass those costs on to the end user. It's just not feasible. For the most part, developers always have a finger on the pulse of the communities that they do business in, and they're going to know what the market will bear when it comes to costs and lease rates. Once municipalities begin asking for anything above and beyond that, it would be expected that the municipalities also step in to offer help, to help make those projects pencil. And ideally, what you end up with, hopefully, is what's called a triple P or a PPP, and that's a public-private partnership. And when you're looking at a real estate development project where people have come to the table early on and everyone understands the end goal, you can get these, you can form these partnerships where the cities and local government and the developers are all involved early on. Everyone understands what the end product will look like, and everyone understands who's bringing what to the table as far as expertise and financing. This is an excellent example of a huge infill development in Midtown Miami. This was a 55-acre abandoned rail yard. And Florida International University came and said, we want to buy this and turn this into student housing, but also a transit-oriented mixed income development with housing and retail and shopping and student union uses. The city was at the table early and they agreed. And within 1 year, they had set up a community redevelopment area. They also formed a community development corporation so that it could take advantage of TIF financing, tax increment financing. They were able to do that within a year. They all worked together to get all of the legal parts put together. And you see here on the bottom, this project coming to fruition has completely changed the fabric of this neighborhood. And it wouldn't have happened if multiple parties didn't show up to the table ready to work together.
Hey, Ben.
Yeah.
We had a question a few minutes ago, and maybe before we go to this second challenge, we could do our best to answer it. It's a good one about explain how highest and best use is determined.
Yeah.
I'll take a first crack at it and you can jump in, but it's a term you hear kind of all the time with development. On one side of it, it's a pretty kind of a technical term from the appraisal world, where it looks at essentially 4 facets of a project, whether or not it's legally permissible, physically permissible, financially feasible. The final thing I believe is like how productive it is as far as a return. So any one of those can get a little bit gray and fuzzy, especially with the legally permissible, is that often looks at local code and zoning regulations, because you have to weigh the fact of how likely is it if the project needs some sort of variance or rezone to pull it off. If it's more than 50% likely that that would be adopted, then that probably should be factored into the highest and best use. I'm guilty of falling into a pattern where I say the term highest and best use kind of removed from that appraisal world, and I look at it more as an aspirational term, trying to align it with goals and objectives that might be found in comprehensive planning or other plans for where the community is heading, making sure that property is forecasting that need, those community needs, and just being maximizing that land. So Ben, I don't know if you'd add anything to that, but
I think that's a really great definition. And one of the other things too about highest and best use is it depends on what the buyer plans to do with it. So if you are planning to buy a 10-acre plot to dump rubber tires on it, and no appraiser is ever going to say that that's the highest and best use, because the highest and best use is, in that case, is not to dump rubber tires if that's the alternative. So they will look at the income producing capacity of the land with improvements, what those improvements are. And then, like Drew mentioned, they'll make sure that it fits into the fabric of the community, legally permissible, but also that it matches with the zoning. So highest and best use is more art than science, I think. And like with cap rates, if the appraiser says the highest and best use is something we disagree with, we just blame the appraiser. So it's kind of a win-win. So on to financing challenge number 2 in financing smart growth is that, inherent friction sometimes exists between what cities want and the level of rents the developer can charge to cover those costs, because you can't always pass those costs on to the end user, like the Boise downtown office example. Right now, or at least the last time I checked, downtown office rent was approximately $25 a square foot or so. So if you came in with a grand plan to build a 100,000 square foot office with a rainwater collection system and ice battery storage in the basement and passive heating and cooling, and you wanted to charge $40 a square foot for that, you're going to end up with an empty 100,000 square foot building, because no one's going to pay $40 a square foot. It just doesn't fit into anybody's business plan who's doing business in Boise, Idaho. So to preserve a high enough return to the developer and meet social goals that the city has, both parties need to meet. And at some level, municipalities know they need to offer financial and government assistance to help make projects pencil. We've already talked about that a little bit, about how public-private partnerships can work for the betterment of everybody. So from the financing perspective, I want to talk a little bit about incentives. And like with anything, the bigger the incentive, the more people will come after that bigger carrot. On a nationwide level, a lot of incentives exist to help smart growth developments get off the ground. Most of those incentives are targeted at low income to mixed income housing. There is some financing targeted at infrastructure improvements to improve traffic in cities or maybe help with transportation. Municipalities often too can direct proceeds from taxes, bond issues, and other funds to projects that would normally have an unattractive return, that have a high social return and meet the city's goals for a given development. Anyone who has been involved in finance, I know there's a couple of people on that are probably familiar with a lot of these, knows that there are a lot of federal programs that exist for housing, and they are incredibly complicated. And so these are some of the federal programs, though, that exist to help with some of these projects. And I'll just run through a couple of these. Home funds are administered by HUD. It's appropriated by Congress, and they appropriate approximately $1.5 billion per year to each and every state plus territories. These are to be used exclusively for low-income activities. CDBG funds are also administered by HUD, and these are community development block grants. These are similar to home funds, but Congress appropriates almost double the amount of home funds, about $3 billion. These encompass more activities. These can be used for infrastructure projects. These can also temporarily right now be used for communities impacted by COVID-19. One of the big differences is home funds are typically loans that are paid back. They're usually soft loans with low interest rates, where CDBG funds are often grants that do not have to be paid back, but you have to continually prove that you're meeting the goals of the grant monies. LIHTC is a big one that most of you have probably heard of. This is low-income housing tax credit administered by the IRS. And it is the most successful low-income program we have in the US. The state housing agencies are allowed by the federal government to allocate these funds. And in our state, it's the Idaho Housing and Finance Administration, or IHFA, who award LIHTC projects here in the state of Idaho. Opportunity zones are new, and these aim to cure blight in depressed communities. And then Section 8, which is actually the Housing Choice Voucher Program, is a voucher program where a tenant pays a small percentage of rent and the program pays the difference. So you can actually collect as a landlord market rent, but your tenants are not paying that market rent. So this incentivizes landlords to provide housing to low-income people. And then there's HUD-VASH, which is a HUD Veterans Administration voucher program. I work on a project here in Boise that receives funding from 4 of these: home, CDBG, LIHTC, and HUD-VASH funds. And oftentimes for a low-income project, this is what it takes, is everybody stepping up and providing funds to make these projects work. The one I want to talk about from a financing perspective is LIHTC, because it's the most powerful and it's the largest program that we really have in the US to tackle low-income housing. This is the world I work in. My employer is a nonprofit property manager and developer. We have about 4,500 units that we own that are all low income, over about, I don't know, 20 states, I think. And we develop our own that we also keep. The way low-income housing tax credits work is it enables developers access to capital from investors in exchange for tax credits. So remember that a tax credit is a dollar-for-dollar reduction in your tax bill. So if you're a large corporation or a very rich individual and you want to protect yourself from paying too many taxes or too high level of taxes, you can buy tax credits and give that to a low-income housing developer and write that amount off against any taxable income you might have. So it works great when the economy is doing really well because corporations have taxable income. So in general, I don't want to dive too far into LIHTC because I don't think we would have time to cover it all, but in general, investors can report tax credits for 10-year period. So investors are willing to pay the annual tax credit amount times 10 because they get to report that amount for 10 years. So a $10 million low-income housing project, say it generates $9 million in tax credits. It generates $900,000 a year. And that's because we use 9% tax credits, which is 70% of the present value of 10 years worth of tax credits. Very complicated. At the end of the day, it works out to be 9%. And Congress has set a floor at 9%. So we take our $10 million deal, we multiply it by 9%. We sell that to an investor, and because they want to have some return on the deal, they might pay us 95 cents on the dollar for those credits. And so that generates $8.5 million for a $10 million project. So do you see any problems with the last example? Anybody want to point out what they see, if anything? Well, the problem is that for a $10 million project, it only generates $8.5 million in equity, leaving almost $1.5 million in financing for the developer to fill. So there's a gap. This is called gap financing, and is typically filled by home funds, CDBG funds, other sources. There are philanthropic families that like to, they have trusts that this is all they do with some of their family money is they put it toward community uses. And it works great until it doesn't work because resources are limited. And so when the money runs out, if Boise runs through its allocation of home funds, that's all they get for the year. They get about $1.5 million a year in home funds. And if they run out in November and a great project comes online in December, there's just no money for that. And so the other issue with relying on gap financing is that all of these things, home funds, LIHTC, CDBG money, this is all federal money. So this is federal money allocated to states to help the population, but it is contingent on annual appropriations by the government, the federal government, authorizing funds to be used for these projects. So every state is basically on the federal dole. And so if the federal government doesn't appropriate enough money, it can be pretty thin. So a couple of state and city programs I think we can take a look at. On a city level, we're looking at impact fee waivers. The city can reduce their impact fees for a project to help make it pencil, or they can offer property tax abatements. And what else? And that's really it. And nationwide, lots of cities can contribute to smart developments out of general funds. They can issue general obligation bonds. They can issue revenue-specific bonds. They can pass local option taxes and other funding mechanisms to make these projects pencil. So a smart growth project with a mix of low-income housing, workforce housing, and transit-oriented development on top of it, you're going to need city help. You just will, especially in Boise, because these projects don't pencil unless you can get full market rents for the entire project. And one of the biggest tools that most people have, that most municipalities have, are the ability to create their own funding mechanisms. For example, New York State offers $4.25 a square foot in tax credits for rooftop gardens. So if you have a 25,000 square foot office building, you can put a garden on it and get a little over $100,000 a year for, I think it's up to 5 years in tax credits. State of California has a net zero residential subdivision goal by about 2024. And one of the things that California has done is they haven't waited for developers to start changing. They've gone to all of the manufacturers, large home system manufacturers, and they're working with them on how to make furnaces and attic fans and windows and doors and siding and insulation more economically efficient to reach that goal. And they take that to the developer and say, here, work with Anderson windows, work with Owens Corning on roof shingles, and they have these ideas to make all of this happen. And frankly, for Idaho, the bitter pill that we kind of have to swallow at the end of all this is that local governments simply cannot raise taxes or issue bonds for special projects. And Drew is going to talk about that later when we pass the baton here. But, Boise could not pass a local option tax. And, there's a lot of anger and frustration about that, about the passage of taxes. A lot of people feel like, these taxes don't sunset. And in some cases, that's simply not true. There's a case study of in Omaha, Nebraska, of citizens voting for a local option tax narrowly by about 50.5% to yay and 49.5% nay for a local option tax to fund some downtown improvements. And in 5 years, when that local option tax sunset, it passed the next year when it went back to vote 80-20. So the people saw the value, but they were able to vote on it. And then the city was able to use those funds for special projects.
And I'm going to do the same thing here because we've had a number of questions come in. I'm also keep an eye on the time here, but going back, Michelle asked, what is reasonable to ask from the developer in a PPP project? Should finances be transparent?
Yes. And really, that's one of the things that should be set up front as an expectation, is that everyone should understand everyone's financial goals and maybe even where the money's coming from. I mean, you might not, as a city, want to be involved with the developer who's getting their money from the family who owns an old cigarette company. You might actually insist on all of that being absolutely transparent. to make sure that you're meeting some of those ESG goals that you have as a city.
And then what happens at the end of the 9 years then when on those tax credits?
So the way it works is you have a 10-year reporting period, but you also have a 15-year compliance period. So the project has to stay compliant with low-income housing guidelines and regulations for 15 years, but it's also up to the state to set the compliance period. So by state, they could also require that low-income housing compliance period be even longer, 20, 25, 30 years. The longest I've ever seen is 40 years, where the project is required to be low-income compliant for 40 years. What usually happens is after the tax credit investor has been in it and gotten their tax credits out after 10 years, and they've maintained compliance for 15 years, they will look to exit the project, and they will look to sell to maybe another low-income housing developer who at that time can rehab the project and layer on new low-income housing tax credits. That's typically how it works.
Yeah, and thanks, Joe. Joe provided some similar information in the chat. The last one real quick is there's a question about the recently announced Franklin and Orchard site and whether or not it's federally funded. I think it's still too early to provide any sort of definitive answer on the financing of the project, but I think it's probably safe to say that some element, especially if there's an affordability goal, will have some piece of federal funding. That's commonly the case for any project that strives to have some affordability in it. Would you agree, Ben?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, there will probably be that component to it as well.
It's usually like a 15-layer cake of different funding streams that go into those projects, and
yeah,
some federal funding will likely be part of that.
Yep, that's exactly right. So I want to wrap up here real quick. I'm running up on about 35, 40 minutes, and I want to give Drew, I think Drew's part's going to be way more interesting than this, so I want to give Drew plenty of time. Financing challenge 3 really, as it relates to Boise and Idaho, really is that cities within the state just lack individual tools for financing smart growth development. And that's not an opinion, and that's not subjective. That's just really true. We are a Dillon's Rule state, which Drew is going to cover in more detail later. And state law will just prevent municipalities from passing laws. We can't impose taxes, and we certainly cannot pass revenue or general obligation bonds without the state's approval, which is not likely to happen because a supermajority vote is required for general obligation bonds from general state funds, and 50% plus one is kind of a tiebreaker vote for revenue bonds. We have 105 delegates in the state. When are we ever going to get 53 to 54 to 67 of them to agree on one thing, especially for one individual city to do something? And so, that's the challenge that we're really up against here. And so real quick, I'm just going to post my takeaways and turn it over to Drew. Smart growth is different things to different people. It's expensive and it requires local government support. These projects often get complicated and require a larger toolbox that at present we lack as a city. And flat out, just that concerted efforts must be undertaken to get buy-in from citizens. At the end of the day, growth is happening. I know there are a lot of people that don't like it. They're angry about it. They want to shut the borders, but that is just not going to happen. Growth is here, it's happening, and we can't continue to say not here somewhere else. So I'm going to turn the time over to Drew. And maybe if there are a couple questions that we should talk about under the financing portion, why don't we open it up to those questions? Feel free to unmute yourself, and let's try to keep it to 5 minutes so we can give Drew plenty of time here to cover his part.
So we're doing a couple questions here, maybe, Ben. Did I hear you right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, if we can. Real quick, Alexandra has a great question I would like to touch on. She says, there's evidence that smart growth increases rents and land value over time. Can this be used to justify higher projected incomes in a pro forma where examples don't exist in the market? This is a great question. The answer is yes. You can use that to justify market rents in the future. The problem is getting your appraiser and your lender on board with that. That is the single biggest hurdle to doing that. I think everybody can agree that these projects are great and they do add value over time. The payback periods might be longer. The problem is usually your lender and your appraiser, in my experience. Getting on board with that and recognizing that the value accretion is going to take place over a lot longer period of time than normal. So hopefully that answers that. Okay, great. Well, hearing none, thanks everyone. Thanks for letting me chat at you for a little while about finance. If you have any questions, please continue to use the chat box, and I'm gonna turn it over to Drew for the really good part of this presentation.
Now we put the best part first, I think, but thanks, Ben. I'm Drew Alexander. Just a real quick introduction on my part. I haven't been in Idaho quite as long as Ben. I haven't won a major spelling bee either, but I grew up out east in Indiana in a small town with about 1,000 people. So oddly enough, I've developed an affinity for urban spaces and places and communities, and it's stuck with me. It continues to grow, and I've had experience in 3 different states now, and Boise/Idaho is easily probably the most fascinating, probably most frustrating oftentimes, but it just creates an interesting setting for this topic. And shifting away from the numbers a bit and the technicality of the financing, now that you're all experts on it, I'm just hoping to take a closer look at what sets Boise and Idaho apart from other areas in ways that do impact project financing. And this portion of the presentation will have a mix of a little bit of history, a few case studies, and hopefully not too many acronyms for you. So what sets us apart? And let's see here, make sure it's working. Idaho is a Dillon's rule state. The second thing is Idaho is a rigid Dillon's rule state. I'll explain what Dillon's rule is in a second, but it really goes back to the Constitution of the United States, where the hierarchy of powers was being established. And you have here in the 10th Amendment showing that transition from the federal level and what was then reserved for the states. Well, as you could imagine, the actual delivery of that was a little messy. And there was some painful points in our time figuring that out. Powers weren't so clearly defined between state and local municipalities. And one of the outcomes in the mid to late 1800s was essentially kind of a prevalence of corruption at the local and municipal level, often influenced by big business and corporations. Well, including laws that were often passed and activities prevailed that didn't always benefit the greater public good. So enters Judge John Forrest Dillon, who was a member of the Iowa Supreme Court during this time, and a case came along to where this was the topic. He essentially delivered an opinion that established precedent all the way up till today on how many states govern. And you see on the slide here, what he essentially interpreted, that powers are granted in express words from the state, the local government, those necessarily implied or necessarily incident to the powers expressly granted, and then those just that are deemed absolutely essential. So this, when it took off, it kind of reestablished this notion of federalism and cemented this belief of narrow government authority. And to this day, nearly 40 states still implement Dillon's rule. However, the severity of the application varies widely. There are broad statutes in some states that provide additional jurisdiction for local government. But here in Idaho, the protection of powers at the state level has been, I would say, much more pronounced than in other states. And that has had a rather significant impact on some of the policy tools, finance tools that we'll see on the following slides. The kind of the antithesis of Dylan's belief is a home rule charter, which essentially kind of creates a system of government where local government is independent from the state, can create their own laws so long as they don't violate those of the state. So it's almost like a state to federal relationship, but between local and state. And that is something that I believe in Idaho we only see where taxes are collected, the collection of authorized taxes. Okay. So that gets us to this laundry list of some affordable housing or mixed-use financing tools that are often used and deployed in other markets. We'll touch on several of these in more detail, so I'm not going to spend too much time hitting them right now, but based on that style of government that I just went through, these are the only ones that we have available to us in Idaho. Let me back up real quick. The Housing Trust Fund, looking at my slide, I'm missing a piece of it there, but it was incorporated into state statute in 1992 for the purpose of helping with the provision of affordable housing, yet it to this day remains unfunded. There's no effective funding mechanism for it. The language sounds pretty compelling and even talks about contributing to match funds needed for home and CDBG awards, but to this day, that's an empty coffer. Incentives that Ben mentioned earlier, there are some incentives available that the city can deploy to developers. The thing to keep in mind with incentives is that they often alone don't push a project over the top, but they do help. And I think an important thing to keep in mind with incentives is that oftentimes they're quantitative with a dollar amount, but they can be qualitative to where you provide some form of assistance or communication or outreach for a project that really aligns with agreed upon community goals or visions that might be in a comprehensive plan. And then these private activity bonds are something that Ben's going to touch on quickly here in a minute. The other and really important one is urban renewal and other special purpose districts. And for us, obviously, that's going to be Capital City Development Corporation, CCDC, and they are our urban renewal agency. There's someone in the audience from Lewiston. I looked up quickly. It looks like you have an urban renewal agency up there as well. So I can't speak toward how similar they are, but probably pretty certain they both operate on same statute and basing activity on tax increment financing, which is what we're going to take a look at here. Got these animations all out of whack, my apologies. So this slide is a graph that shows you how urban renewal works in Idaho. The TIF, tax increment financing, is probably the primary term to remember when discussing urban renewal financing. And how it works is that there's a study period at the outset where if an area is identified as possibly being blighted or an opportunity for urban renewal is studied, and there's clear language in state statute on how those studies should occur and how that is actually determined. Once that hurdle is cleared and a district and a plan is created, there's essentially a snapshot date that happens to where the property values at that time are frozen in place. And in Boise for CCDC, their districts run for 20 years. So this next area of the graph that you see is where the urban renewal district would be essentially doing its thing. It would be using any increased value on those properties, that tax increment financing, and capturing that and using it to implement those infrastructure projects that it outlined in the plan during the study period. And the idea here is more and more of that happens and that area has more and more improvement. The appraised value continues to rise and there's more funding in that bucket to do more of these projects. And at the end of the term, the district goes away and all of that value returns back to the baseline collection, essentially. So that's in a quick and dirty explanation of how urban renewal works here. The CCDC has 4 or 5 districts at the moment, I believe. Shoreline and the Gateway District are some of the more recent ones. So I believe Shoreline was adopted a year or 2 ago, and we'll have 20 years to see that plan unfold. Ben, do you want to talk about this one real quick? I think you're still muted.
Okay, thank you. Yes, all right. So real quick, private activity bonds are another tool available to every state. They're secured by private projects. And what the IRS does is they allocate the minimum of $105 per capita or $311 million a year. And they encompass about 41 approved activities. And these are especially fascinating to me when it comes to studying, you know, how Idaho and how Boise in particular can potentially finance some of these projects. Is these private activity bonds can be issued by a state agency, in this case IHFA, for private use. So they can go out and issue a bond for someone if they wanted to build a railroad station or a water desalination plant, an airport, a light rail system, which I know gets batted around a lot. I looked up the last balance that Idaho had in our outstanding private activity bond usage. And it looked like last year, our outstanding carry forward amount, any amount you don't use, you get to keep for 4 years. So it rolls over. And our carry forward balance was about $900 million. And so Idaho has the allocation of almost $1 billion authorized by the IRS that we could issue private activity bonds for some of these uses. And 2018 issuance was only $187 million for mortgage revenue bonds. And what that looks like is $181 million went to typically first-time homeowners for secured mortgages. And then another $6 million went for industrial development bonds. And the thing I find really fascinating about these private activity bonds is I couldn't find anything in, I believe it's Title 50 of state law about issuing these bonds that says that we can't issue $100 million everywhere. And so, you know, when I was working on my master's degree, I did submit a Freedom of Information request a few years ago about this to try to understand it better. And I never got resolution and kind of forgot about it until recently. But I think this is a really fascinating potential income tool to be able to issue these bonds for projects. And, you know, if there's anybody on here that knows more about this or has a contact at the Department of Commerce, I think it'd be great if you'd reach out offline if we could discuss more. But that to me feels like a huge untapped source of funding for smart growth development or other infrastructure needs that we have. $900 million goes a long way. So.
Thanks, Ben. I think before I talk about a couple of the tools that are not available, the one that we don't have on the slides is just private equity. There's a lot of talk development circles these days about unlocking private equity and creating vehicles for investors that might be interested in financing smart growth related projects to come to the table. If you're interested in that, there's a whole stream of investing called impact investing. That's one way to learn a little bit more about that. But there are capital funding groups starting up that are looking at projects like we're talking about, and I think it's important that we remain focused on that and try to find ways to get them engaged, especially here in Boise. So these are a couple of the more important ones that you don't have access to at the moment in Idaho. One is a real estate transfer tax. And that's simply just a tax that's imposed when property is transferred from one party to another. It can range anywhere from 0.1% to 4%. I think that 4% number was coming from Pittsburgh, perhaps. But typically, if allowed, jurisdictions can set their own rates. And in many areas, this RET revenue is channeling into public transportation programs or housing programs. So it's an important piece that we don't have here. Just another tool that's absent in our policy toolbox. The important thing is that any additional tax like this, you have to have some caution that you don't create even more of a barrier to home ownership, especially with some of your lower income earners. So in many places, they'll have this on either just a certain amount of the sale or on sales above a certain amount. So it takes some crafting, but again, that's nothing that we have at the moment in Idaho. One that you've likely heard about is the local option tax. That's technically available in Idaho, but to resort communities with populations under 10,000. Michelle, I believe you have some experience with local option there in McCall, but you know the economies must be essentially based on recreation and tourism, and to pass a local option tax in those areas, I believe it's a 60% majority vote is needed. I did some quick scanning to see if any of those areas are close to exceeding 10,000 in population, but it looks like they're still well within that limit. But those are the only areas in Idaho that have that ability. And it too is often one of the more powerful resources that communities, regions, cities, states use to fund smart growth related development. They're often assessed on a sales tax, portion of a sales tax. And it's always getting into a little bit of opinion here, but it's always struck me as a bit odd, knowing what we know about Idaho, that with it, a lot of pride in local control, that this tool isn't available to our citizens, sort of giving them the decision to control where their tax dollars are going to. So there's been a few efforts in the past to try to unlock this tool statewide. I know there's people on the call that have been involved with those campaigns and probably have a lot more information about this than I do, but it's an important one, and I think it's one that still begs a lot of advocacy for regionally to try to get maybe some momentum behind that again here in Idaho. We do have development impact fees, but we don't necessarily have proportional impact fees or can't put impact fees for affordable housing purposes. So that's another missing link for us too on the policy platform. So going to a poll real quick, after seeing that list and seeing what's available and what's not, Sarah, you might have to start it since I'm presenting, but you get that to come up. Sarah, are you able to, there we go. So again, now that you've seen the tools available for financing smart growth, would you say Idaho has more carrots or more sticks?
All right, we got some people taking it. I'm going to give it a few more minutes to see if we can get everybody's participation here.
And I'll vote sticks. I just don't want to move the mouse and take the slideshow.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll see what happens. I'm going to close it down. Give you a
Okay.
few seconds. Okay, here we go.
That's interesting. It's really interesting to see that because I view us in more of an environment where we have to entice good development with attracting projects of a certain type because with the policies that we just went over that we don't have access to, of which include some things like inclusionary zoning, we can't necessarily or can't easily tell a developer in Idaho, you shall. That's been challenged very frequently in the past here, and it's often, it really heightens the need to have codes and comprehensive plans that seek out, I'll use it, that highest and best use. So no wrong answer here, but I've tended to view our policy environment here full of having more carrots than sticks. And because of that, I also view the importance of collaboration even that much more important here because there's just it's necessary to try to work with other agencies and jurisdictions to accomplish these goals when we don't have some of these tools at our fingertips. So. Get that closed. So I just grabbing a couple graphics from some recent reports. I would encourage looking up these reports if you're interested in reading about some of these topics, but this gets into a little bit of what Ben was explaining about project costs, but this helps understand the breakdown of the project financing and just what goes into that. You've got, anywhere from 50 to 70% of a project typically in hard costs, and a pretty large proportion of the overall cost not going to construction itself. But this one I thought was really relevant for today, and this is a takeaway from that report that talks about project characteristics on median unit costs for those LIHTC projects. And this was from a nationwide assessment. And when we talk about smart growth policy and tools, you can really try to hone in on these two areas where you have unit counts and parking. And fortunately, they're the most distinct ones on having an impact on a project's overall unit cost. So what this is saying is if structured parking is a required component of a LIHTC project, that unit's cost is going to increase by 27%. Whereas on the other side of that, if you're able to find a site and develop a project with greater densities, oftentimes slightly smaller units, that unit cost goes down all the way up to about 42%. So a lot of these tools that we're talking about, either the ones we have available or don't, tend to focus on these areas. These are just a couple of really important areas where I think that we do have some mechanisms with our land use codes to do some work on helping in these two areas. Another report that came across recently had to do specifically with parking requirement impacts on housing affordability. This is from the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, and it looks broadly, it's not just at one market, but the important takeaway here is that it just is showing very clearly what happens when parking is required as part of a project. you see, I'll look at the slide on the right, where if you start requiring up to 2 spaces for a project, the maximum potential units per acre there drops almost in half. Especially if those units, the target units, are 1-bedroom or studio units. And then also that cost to develop that parking ultimately translates to the housing costs and to the tenant typically. So that's what the left graph is showing, where especially in urban higher price markets, that parking requirement really influences things. I put this slide in just to kind of give a gut check of where some markets are at. That same donut chart there is similar to the one a few slides ago, but in a market like San Francisco, you're seeing the soft costs, I'll call them, even though it includes land, actually being greater than 50% of the single unit's development cost. And just take a minute to grapple with that affordable housing fee of almost $90,000 on a unit. Just goes to show how markets and development and financing are vastly different from one another. You know, if we were in a declining area or a flat area where not a lot of growth was happening, this might just be something to be in amazement about. But I think it serves an important point to try to stay ahead of the curve of what high demand can do for a market and how we can try to implement some strategies to retain smart growth principles and keep ahead of the curve. The next area is on transportation financing tools. And there's some similarities here to the affordable housing or mixed use development, but transportation in general is in Idaho. There's taxes and fees that fund it, but and also in large part federal funds, federal awards. Here in the Treasure Valley, Compass is our metropolitan planning agency, and they are essentially the conduit for a lot of the federal funding that comes for transportation projects. And then I've got the double asterisk there on those two again that we don't have access to. So if we have that next poll, Sarah, I got a question about this next slide. I know we're almost out of time. I'm hurrying. True or false? Valley Regional Transit receives a majority of its revenue from taxes.
It looks like that poll is missing the very important last word, so I apologize for that.
That's okay.
Okay, I'll give everybody a few more minutes. If you want to answer the poll, and then I'll share the results.
Yeah.
And by a few more minutes, I mean a few more seconds.
Seconds, yeah. Let's go ahead and end it. We got a few more slides to push through. So we've got 63% saying false and 38% saying true. The answer is really there's hardly any zero taxes that arrive at our transit authority. Most of their funding comes from federal assistance, local assistance, and then just a very small amount from auxiliary reserves and generated funds, which are tickets essentially. Those local assistance are not to be confused with taxes. They're contributions from the agencies throughout the valley, often from general funds to help support VRT. And just to give you a comparison, Spokane is looked at a lot as a comparable market. They have a budget in 2020 of 111 million, with just over 87 million of that coming from sales tax. And that is driven from those same tools that we mentioned earlier, local option, and I believe there's some RET element as well in that area. So hopefully that gives you an example of how different this area operates on public transit than others. So the final thing on this before we talk about a couple of things happening at the moment is that I believe another offshoot of the governing model in Idaho is that it really sets the stage, creates ripple effects through local planning efforts. It can be sort of conducive to creating protective or defensive stances for agencies and their duties, kind of like lines in the sand, so to speak. And when you look at these agencies, they often have one or two really high top priorities that they're striving to obtain. And so the question becomes, is smart growth the common thread between them? And often it's not. And often it takes a heck of a lot of collaboration between these agencies to try to accomplish some smart growth visioning, especially when funding is controlled predominantly in one or two of these agencies and not another. So I'm trying to be very respectful of people's time, keep moving here. I can get this to advance. So if you have to go, I totally understand. I think we just hit time, but we'll try to wrap up, and I'll say 5 minutes here. What's happening at the moment that's related to what we've been talking about? And the first thing that I wanted to reference was City of Boise's upcoming zoning ordinance. It was put on hold momentarily, but I believe it's picking up speed again, and we'll be probably seeing more about that. I always use this silly analogy that I use with zoning codes, and especially when they're being adjusted, so bear with me quickly. But I view that activity similar to when an automobile is under a recall. You know, it's sometimes scary, it's usually frustrating for people, and requires effort to fix it. Importantly, it really wasn't ever probably the automobile manufacturer's intent to have a part fail on their car. So you can compare these instances to appeals, variances, rezonings, conditional use permits that hit meeting agendas at planning and zoning and city council. And the thing is, if those happen frequently enough, it kind of starts telling you something. And if there's risk and stress involved with those, just like with a recall, it's probably time to sit down and fix it. Those temporary fixes can be done through procedural code amendments, less frequently moratoria. But after time, it's really, and enough has changed, essentially time to design a new car. And this upcoming major update, I think, can hopefully be viewed that way, that the community will be taking into account all those lessons learned, changes in preferences, and using it to strive to accomplish those goals. As we know, we don't have access to a lot of those tools, policy tools, but looking at things like densities and parking requirements to help lower the financing burden or to create more financing or opportunity for projects when it comes to financing. Kid on this just a little bit, but parking requirements, densities, obviously in appropriate amounts and appropriate areas. There's an opportunity here to maybe have a hybrid approach of Euclidean versus form-based versus performance zoning. If I had more time, I'd try to dive into that a little bit, but more incentives for desired development. Use this opportunity to help curtail sprawl and encourage smart growth, appropriate areas, and then just an enhanced approval process for desired development. What I mean by that is when projects that really adhere to community-wide goals and aspirations, that they have clear process and probably something that doesn't entail the need for variances or conditional use permits, and those items that often drag out at City Hall or in commissions and councils. Another thing happening at the moment is with the county. They're undertaking this coordinated growth for Ada County. You may have gone to a few of the listening sessions. I encourage you to go. They're really taking a concerted effort to look at the financial impacts of the rapid growth that we're seeing in Ada County. And I've even worked recently with Compass with a small grant to start developing a fiscal impact analysis that we should be able to do some modeling to say if this project goes here, it will actually cost X amount in infrastructure, so that we can really have a clear picture of if we're going to be able to afford the services and infrastructure that we'll need if we continue to grow in manners that we have. So if you're interested at all in that, I would continue participating in that if you have, so by all means. And then again, the urban renewal districts, there's a couple of them that were recently announced. I believe the most recent study is likely going to be along State Street. And that process is going to be similar to the ones in the past outlined by state statute, where there's evaluation and public process. If you participated in shoreline when it formed, it'll probably be something somewhat similar to that. The cool thing with these districts is that at the end, and the plans are adopted and published, they're clearly available to the public, and it outlines action plans. This is from Shoreline, to where you can pull up the plan and find what CCDC hopes to accomplish in quarter increments. That would be 5-year increments. So really interesting documents, and I'd encourage you to spend some time on the CCDC site to learn more about how urban renewal is created, but also how it's implemented after the fact. And then finally, I have a couple slides here just to remind you that the State Street Transit-Oriented Development Project is closely related to that urban renewal study that's underway. And VRT recently published a report looking at a really exciting vision for State Street. So again, if you're interested in participating in some of these areas and you see an opportunity to weigh in on something like this, I encourage you to do so. And that's pretty much it. And other than encouraging you to keep your eyes and ears open for any project or development application that embodies elements of smart growth. There's always room for advocacy for those projects, especially if there's public testimony. So that's always a good venue to show your support for that type of work.